Choosing whether to focus on the SAT or the ACT is obviously quite the consequential decision. So what I want to do in this video is give you some advice. Even though it is an individual decision, it's going to depend a lot on your particular situation. There are some general guidelines that I can give you that can give you the framework to make the best decision you can. And the most important point that I want to make to start off with is that you do want to pick a test. So focus and master one test. Even though there is some overlap between the tests in terms of content, in particular the ACT English and the SAT writing, and they're both standardized tests and they're timed, there's some overlap. There's really not enough overlap, in my opinion, where studying for one will significantly help you with the other. The differences are stark enough that you really want to specialize. You want to find the test that works best for you and focus on it. Now, you might have to, as we'll talk about in a second, experiment a little bit with both tests to see which one you like. But once you've made that determination, you want to pick that test and move on from there. So how do you decide which test is better for you? Now that we know you have to pick one. And there's two major factors. One is what we'll call somewhat skeptically natural ability. And the other is personal preference. So let's start with natural ability. And all I mean by natural ability is just that some students do better in one or the other for a whole host of reasons. We don't have to go into all of them, but you might just do better on the ACT without prep than you would on the SAT without prep, or vice versa. So what you have to first determine is there a difference for you in terms of natural inclination, natural preference, based on your strengths and what you've learned so far. And really the only objective way to do this is to take a practice SAT and take a practice ACT and compare the scores. So you might have already taken them, and in which case you can just compare them directly. You might have only taken one or the other, in which case if you go to my website, download a practice test, take the full practice test timed, then you can make the comparison. If you've taken the PSAT, I suppose it's okay to use your PSAT scores in the way that we're going to use these scores in a second to compare to ACT, but it is better if you had an actual full SAT. So that said, what do you do to compare? So if you go to my website, there's a link in the description, it'll bring you to this table. This table is what you can use. It's called a concordance table to compare equivalent SAT and ACT scores. So let's just come up with a scenario. Let's pretend you got a 1250 on the SAT. And let's say you got a 27 on the ACT. And the question is, am I better at one of the tests or the other? So you go to the table, you find your SAT score, which is right here, 1250. And you look at what ACT score that corresponds to. In this case, it corresponds to a 26. And there's a little bit of a judgment call here, but my opinion is if your score is within 2 points, if your real ACT score is within 2 points of the score listed here, it's basically a wash. There's not much of a difference. So in this case, if I got a 27 ACT, a 26 ACT, it's more or less the same. So you're going to have to look for personal preference factors, which we're going to talk more about in a second. If your ACT score is, let's say, 3 or more points away from the equivalent score as revealed by this table, then you might lean one way or the other. So for example, if another person got the same SAT score, but they got a 30 ACT, that's 4 points away from the 26. That's the equivalent on this concordance table. So I would advise this person to lean very strongly in favor of the ACT, focusing on that test, though personal factors may still weigh in a little bit, and we'll talk about that in a second. Or alternatively, if someone got the same SAT score, but let's say they got a 22 ACT, that's 4 points below the 26. That's a significant enough difference where you might then want to lean towards the SAT. So this is a good first pass to see if there's really any obvious difference. And if there is, that's really going to color your decision one way or the other. But I do want to say it's not determinative. So even if, let's say you had someone with a 30 ACT and a 1250 SAT, might be some extenuating circumstances there. Maybe you prepped a bunch for the SAT. You prepped a bunch for the ACT and not so much for the SAT, so there might be more room to grow on the SAT. And maybe you just like the SAT better, you're just sick of thinking about the ACT, you'd rather focus SAT. So even with this measure, it's not 100% go one way or the other. You have to balance other factors, which we'll talk about in a second. But at least it gives you a first pass, good sense of where you're at. So if the scores are equivalent, or even if there is a difference, you should still think about these 4 questions that you should ask yourself when you are determining whether you should do the SAT or the ACT. The first question is, do you prefer the format, the structure, or the style or the feel of one test over another? So you have to ask yourself, do you prefer the way one test feels in kind of a general sense to how the other test feels? So, for example, the ACT is a lot more about time pressure. The questions, especially in the reading test, for example, are easier than the questions you would see on SAT reading, but the time pressure is much more intense. So that's the trade-off. So you might prefer a test that is longer, it's got more questions, like the ACT, so therefore you've got less time to do the questions in, but the questions are easier. Whereas the SAT, you've got generally fewer questions and more time, but the questions overall are harder. So that balance between question difficulty and the time you've got, you might lean one way or the other. If you really hate that really big time pressure, you probably would lean SAT. You might also prefer the way that the SAT, for example, does their math. Even though they've got a no calculator section, whereas on the ACT you can always use your calculator, you just might not like, for example, the way the ACT has more topics, right? The ACT is generally broader in the variety of topics that it presents for questions, whereas the SAT, it's a bit more focused on, say, algebra, specific types of questions. On the SAT, focused around algebra rather than broader things you'd see on the ACT math. So that might make a difference for you. And again, at the link in the description below, I have a table which basically covers the major differences of the 2 tests. So this might give you some ideas as to which one you might prefer. So the second question you might ask yourself is, do you like science? Obviously, a major difference between the tests is the ACT has a science test and the SAT does not, even though it has some sciencey stuff mixed in all throughout the test. That's really just the SAT's attempt to pay lip service towards science. The ACT has the dedicated science test, and that's a major difference. So if you are big on AP science or honors science, you're really interested in science, you're relatively good at it, might make you lean towards the ACT because you can use that skill to your advantage. If, on the other hand, you hate science, you can't stand it, you don't want to think about it, you're not quite good at it, at least right now, maybe makes you lean towards the SAT. So that science decision can really make a big difference in terms of which tests you're going to focus on. The third question that we're going to look at is basically asking yourself, what are your friends or your colleagues doing? What are other people in your school or people that you know, your peer group, what tests are they taking? And why this is important is more of an institutional thing. So if all your friends are studying for the SAT, might be then a good idea to lean towards SAT because then you could study together, you could share resources, you can ask each other questions, right? There's more synergy there. If you go off your own way doing the ACT, you're not alone because you can find other resources like the study group that I run on for Reason Prep. But just might make you want to lean one way or the other. Same thing if your school is big on SAT. So there's like an SAT prep class that your school runs extra help, your teachers run SAT prep, whatever it might be, institutionally, you might even lean one way or the other. And this also depends a lot on geography. So it used to be more the case that the coasts of the United States and internationally was all about SAT, and the middle of the United States was ACT. It's blurring a lot more now, but you still see some of that holdover. So I'm in New Jersey. Most students focus primarily, at least at first, on SAT, though that's changed a little bit recently with the ACT becoming more popular. If you're in Iowa or something, you might focus a lot more on the ACT just institutionally, and that may push you one way or the other. And again, with all these questions, it's not going to be the determinant. Even if all your friends are doing the SAT, and if your school runs SAT prep classes, if the ACT is a better fit for you, it's a better fit for you, right? But it's just another factor to consider as you're making your decision. And then the final question to ask yourself is, have you prepped or have you spent any time or effort preparing for one test or the other? As we were already discussing when we were going over the first part of this, which was, are you better at one of the tests? If you've prepped a lot for the ACT and not so much for the SAT, that kind of messes up that comparison a little bit. But it's still a thing to think about. If you're gonna, let's say you spent a lot of time prepping for the SAT, and then you just take a practice ACT to compare, and your ACT score is significantly better without prep. That pushes you, even though you've done all that prep on the SAT to this point, that is a pretty strong argument to make for the ACT being the test for you. The other situation is, well, what if there's a bit more ambiguity? You're more or less the same SAT versus ACT, and you've done a lot of preparation already for the SAT. Should you switch? In that situation, you might lean more towards the SAT because you've already put in the time, the effort, the money perhaps to prep for that test. We don't want to get stuck in the sunk cost fallacy, but nonetheless, it might still be a good idea to stick with what you've already started preparing for, tweaking your approach, continuing to push to master it, rather than essentially starting over with a new test. But again, depends on the scores, depends on how you feel about the tests. It might be worth it to switch. That's where the personal judgment comes in. And the last tip that I can give, it's not really a question to ask yourself, but it's really questions to ask others, and that's to get advice. So every person's situation is different, right? There's all these, as you can see, many factors that come together to make the decision for you in terms of which test to focus on, and you may need some help weighing those factors. So ask a teacher, ask a friend, ask your tutor. You can even ask me. Feel free to reach out, especially if you're one of my tutoring students or if you're a member of Reason Prep. Reach out and ask. Ask in the study group, link in the description below for Reason Prep's SAT and ACT study group. Get some advice, get some feedback. But in the end, you got to make the decision. And you know what? If it's really close, like if you don't really care either way and you're more or less the same, then it doesn't matter. Pick whichever test you'd like in that case. The one thing I would say, this is a little bit of a dated comment, so if you're watching this video not in December 2016, like maybe a year from now, this could be different. The one thing that might push you in that situation where you're really stuck between them into the ACT camp is simply the availability of resources. There's a lot more practice test materials available for the ACT than for the new SAT because it's new. But in a year or two or three, that may not really be much of a consideration anymore. But it is one thing a very minor point to think about. So I'll throw that in here. But yeah, get advice, ask questions, think about it, and then make a decision because you really want to focus on one test so that you can go for mastery, not to be mediocre in both tests. You want to master one test to maximize your score. And that's the plan, that's the goal. To learn more about Reason Prep's SAT, SAT subject test, and ACT video courses, go to reasonprep.com/enroll, and you can find the link in the description below the video.